Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to look at the background research chapter of your project. And as you'll notice on the screen in front of you, this chapter is worth about 8 marks, assuming you achieve all of the standards, which I'm about to outline. And I'm also going to show you in this tutorial how to go about writing a background research, how it should be structured. And I suggest that you also take a look at some of the sample background researches that have been included for you to look at to see how various students have tackled the writing of the background research. Now, a well-written background research does many things, and it's not just your ability to access the 8 marks in the actual background research, but when you come to do your analysis later on in your findings and when you make conclusions, the analysis in your findings and your conclusions will, to some extent, be based on some of the material that you dug up in your background research. And therefore, if it's not there in your background research, or if you haven't done a very good background research, it becomes very difficult later on in your findings and your conclusion to actually achieve the full range of marks. So let's have a little look at actually what you're trying to do. What is a background research? Well, the exam board wants to see that you have demonstrated a detailed knowledge and understanding of the topic that you are studying. Okay, so what does that really mean in plain English? Well, you have established a series of research questions, okay, that are centered around your central aim, and you can see that here. Okay, so you have developed 3 research questions, and you'll have already done that in the previous previous chapter of the project. And they will have been very clearly written in terms of what you aimed to achieve. Now, in this chapter, you are developing, showing that you understand what these 3 research questions are about. You're expanding on what they are, and mainly what you're doing is you are focusing on material that you have discovered through your own reading and research that explains what you should be expecting to find. What are your results likely to be? What work have other people who are researching in this field found? And it's very, very important that you can uncover material done by other people, research by other geographers or other people that work in the field that you're particularly looking at in this project, and that you're reporting that back. So it's not what you think, it's what other people have discovered. What some students do is when they find a particularly good study that maybe somebody from a university or somebody out in the world of business and industry has done in a certain area that's very similar to what they are researching, but not quite the same, they sometimes tweak their research questions. And what I mean by that is they change them slightly or they reword them. So actually they are able to use these studies as the background, as the basis for what they're going to investigate. So if you do find a really good study that somebody else has done and you like it and you think, oh, this person's got some interesting results, I wonder if my results from my river or my town or my surveys or whatever it is you're researching, how that would compare if I was to do that project myself or that particular study myself. Well, then do make the change. Come and chat, obviously, with your teacher in advance of making that change. But it's really useful to build around your study around some pre-existing results. I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, it says here, when you write your findings, you should make direct reference to the research you discussed in this chapter. Okay, now when we get to the findings, that's going to be reinforced, and you'll be reminded that it's a very important step that you compare your results, that is the data that you've gathered on the thing that you're researching, to the prior research that you've conducted and that you'd written about in this background research. And you're going to be doing that explicitly. What that means is you'll be directly referring back to something that you write about in this chapter. You should include very clear reference to all the sources that you use, and I'll show you how to do that. I've already explored that in the introduction, but I will remind you how the approach you should take. Okay, so this should be cited in the main text, and this citation should be linked to a detailed bibliography at the back of your study, as well as obviously being in the footnote at the bottom of a page. All right, let's have a little look at what the exam board says, and then I'll show you what it looks like, what a good background research should look like. Okay, there are 3 key areas they want you to address to maximize your marks. Okay, your 8 marks. They want to show that your reading, the research you've done is relevant to the topic you've decided to study. Okay, so don't talk about or refer to any knowledge that isn't in any way linked to the actual focus of your research. So what is your research question on, and make sure you stick to it and you don't stray from that. Okay. You should expand on what you're studying, give reasons or evidence related to the topic being studied. So this is really just showing what you know about each of your 3 research questions. And the final thing, and this is the most important, is where you must use your background research or the knowledge and understanding you're writing about to support your findings. Now, obviously, you won't be doing that yet because you won't have any findings because you've not actually got your data. But when you do go out and then get your data, when you research whatever it is you're doing and you're sitting back, putting it into spreadsheets and drawing your graphs and your maps and your charts, and you're looking at it thinking, what do my results show? You should think about what you wrote about in your background research and think, do my results back up what I learned about in my background research and wrote about, or do they not? And you should be very cleverly actually explaining whether they do or don't. So how do I get 7 or 8 marks? Well, if you are very clear and explicit, so there's that word explicit again, in using the evidence in your results, in your own findings, and saying whether they are supported or not by the background research or the research that you've done in this particular chapter, and you actually say, for example, you write a sentence that says, my result of 6.3 was very similar to that uncovered by the research done by, and then you would just quote whoever done that research that you wrote about in your background research. Okay. The results that you have must be there to support your findings, or in the case if they don't support, then you would say so. Okay. And they must help with your analysis. So when you are trying to explain your results, you should be using knowledge and understanding that you learned about and you picked up from your background research chapter. So anything you've said in your background research chapter about what you should expect to find or what other people have discovered should now be used to support a line of argument, to support points that you're making about your own results. Okay. And that's going to become more apparent later on when we get to the findings. But when I go through this example with you in a second, it will be important to bear in mind that anything you set up here will pay off in a lot more marks, not just the 8 marks available here, but in a range of other marks that you achieve in the other chapters, especially the findings. So there's some key points. Just have a quick little read through them. Pause at this stage and take any notes that you feel you need to take. I will reinforce these ideas in a second in the model background research. Okay, let's have a look at a model background research. Now, first thing is, there's your heading for the chapter. It should always be on a new page, nice big 14 font, much bigger than the rest of the text, so it stands out. And you should never start a new chapter a third or halfway down a page. You should always take a new page for a new chapter. Also, you're going to want to break down your background research into each of the 3 research questions. As you are developing 3 sub areas that you're studying, it makes logical sense to structure your background research into 3 sub areas. So I've got my subheading 1, research question 1. You'll also notice that in this case, we're doing a different study. This is a study on the gradient, that's the angle of a slope, and how it influences the pH, or what we call the acidity, and the moisture of a soil. And this is an actual study that a student did a few years ago. So they reminded, in this case, the reader, me, what is that first research question back about? I could turn back a page where I would find those 3 research questions outlined. But this is just a nice little flourish where they're constantly reminding me as I read, right, here's my first research question, here's what it's on, and then in they go. Now, this first sentence is really just outlining what is the background research about, especially if the reader might not be sure what is meant by pH or moisture content, or if the research question needs a little bit of fleshing out. Now, you might have already done this in your actual research question chapter, so this paragraph might be irrelevant. Okay. What comes next is highly relevant for achieving the marks. Okay. So if you reflect back to what I was saying earlier on in this tutorial, that it's very important you show or can demonstrate wider reading and knowledge and understanding. So what I want to know by the time I've read through this is how does gradient influence the acidity of a soil, and how does the gradient influence how much water or moisture is in the soil? I should know how gradients is influencing that. And you should be telling me, and you should be telling me based on material that you have read. Okay. And I shouldn't leave this particular section of the background research for research question 1 until I fully understand how gradient, the angle of a slope, is influencing the pH and the moisture. Okay. So let's have a look at how the student did this. So in the first one, they go straight in. They say an article written in Modeling Earth Systems and Environment publication looked at the effects of soil gradient on soil quality. Now, before we look at what they've discovered, you'll notice there's the little citation mark. In the previous chapter, we had a number 1 with little brackets around it. Now, by the way, if that is not your first citation, if this is like your 5th one, maybe you've already done 4 in previous chapters, that shouldn't say number 1, that should say number 5. Okay, so each time you do a little citation number, it should be 1 higher than the previous one. I should also be able to scroll down to the bottom of the page and see there it is. So there's the source from which that particular piece of evidence comes from, and that should also be placed in your bibliography, which you will have been introduced to in your introduction. And you should make sure you're continually updating your bibliography with the author, the name of the article, the publication if it's got a name, or the website. There's the title there of an article, and also when it was published or when you viewed it on the internet if you can't find out when it's published. And if it's off the internet, you should have the web link. Okay, so let's just go back to having a think about, we want to know something about gradient. So by the time you read through this, and you might just want to pause now and just read through that, you will understand that flatter gradients have pHs that are higher or less acidic, and that steeper gradients have lower pHs or are more acidic. But something that's even more important that the student has done, and if you're able to do this at least once, twice, or even 3 times across all of your background research, then you are going to get very high marks. They have found some data in this research. So this article, Modeling Earth Systems and Environment, has actually found out what the pH of a steep gradient is, and that when the gradient at 5.32 are on steeper gradients, and high values of pH at 6.4 were found on slopes less than 2 degrees. So steep slopes have got that, and flat slopes that are less than 2 degrees have got that. Now, why is that important? Because if I'm going to now study slopes and how they influence pH, wouldn't it be interesting to see if my slope, wherever I had a slope that was less than 2 degrees, does it have a pH similar to that? Likewise, if it's a much steeper slope, is it that? Now, we're not told at what level the gradient is to be 5.32 pH, but it would be helpful if that had been in the research and we were told. So, for example, if it was slopes that are steeper than 10 degrees in angle, then we could compare our own results to that. But we've got some data which later on, when we get to our findings, we could compare our slopes, if we have to assume that will be the project we're doing, to these pHs. Okay. Therefore, steeper gradients were discovered to be significantly more acidic. Now, this student's gone a little bit further. They're looking at why is that. So why do steeper gradients have a more acidic soil? So a study in Canada found the lowest value of pH at steeper gradients and explained that this is due to the loss of basic cations through runoff, which increases activities of ions, thus increasing soil acidity. Now, you don't actually need to know what that means. But it would make sense if you did know what it means. I suspect the student wasn't too sure about the science that lies behind this, because they're writing in a way that, other than the specialist, it's unlikely that a reader is going to know that. So it would have been helpful to be a bit clearer. But what is clear is they have done some research, and they have found out why are steep slopes more acidic, and it's basically to do with the washing out of certain ions that influence the acidity of the soil, and that's what they've told us. So they've added a bit of knowledge to that, and we can therefore find out if that's true when we do our own study. Are the ions being removed more, and that's what's leading to more acidic soils in the study that we would be conducting if this was our project. Right, but because this research question's got 2 angles, they've gone a little bit further. We now want to know about soil moisture and gradient. So they've found another study. This time it's the Journal of Hydrology, and they found that steeper slopes are drier than flat areas due to lower infiltration rates, rapid surface drainage, and higher surface runoff. So here they've got some knowledge. They've told us that steep slopes are drier. And the reason for that is for three things to do with infiltration. That's how easily water can go into soil. The fact that the subsurface drainage, as it flows through the soil, is quicker, it's more rapid, and as is the water flowing on the surface more rapid. And that is why steeper slopes have less water in them. But more so than giving us this knowledge, which is really important, we have to remember what I said. By the end of reading this particular part, I need to understand what the thing that the student is researching is doing what it's doing. They've actually found some data. They've discovered that flat gradients typically had moisture content above 40% in contrast to steeper gradients above 10 degrees, which had a moisture content below 20%. Now, as above, because they've found that in this study that flat slopes have more than 40% of the soil is more than 40% water, whereas steep gradients, when they're above 10 degrees in angle, they tend to have less than 20% water in them. That once again allows me later on in my findings to compare my results to this particular study. Now, this is obviously a model example, a very, very high level of example. So the students managed to find two studies where they gave some data about the results that they discovered in terms of the gradient and the moisture, and in this case, gradient and the soil acidity. And those sources also went and explained why those variations happen. There is a little bit more here. There's a nice diagram being included, figure 2, as the students called it. And the reason for doing this is then the next research question in this student's project was how soil acidity influenced the organic content of the soil. So that's how fertile the soil was. And because that was their next research question, they wanted to build up towards that by showing us that the more acidic the soil is, that's over here in the diagram, the less likely vegetation is going to grow. And as the acidity comes down, the more likely it is that vegetation can grow. Okay, so they've found this piece of research and they've explained that link between how acidic a soil is and how much grows in that soil, which then is explored, as they say here. It's a theme that's explored in research question 2. Now, that's a really nice thing to do at this stage, because what they're doing is they're interweaving their 3 research questions. Whilst they would then write on the next page, have the next subheading, which would say research question 2. They're just getting us ready for research question 2 by showing that there is actually a link between research question 1 and 2. And I would think in your have a final short paragraph that maybe looks to link each of your 3 research questions together. So when the reader's reading it, it all flows. One final thing, what's the word length? Well, if we have a little look at the word count on this doesn't count as word count because it's a title. We will find out that the word count is 275. So what is the word limit? Well, as you are going to be doing 3 of these, research question 1, 2, and 3, in total, you want all 3 to add up to no more than somewhere between 800 to 900 words. That is an absolute maximum. And I would suggest trying to limit it to around about 200 to 250 words per research question. And in total, you don't want to go much higher than 800 and an absolute limit 900 words. And that isn't just for one. This is just one example, but you would have 3. So this would, whilst this only takes up 1 page, by the end of your background research, you'll be looking at 3 or 4 pages. It really depends on how many diagrams you have included. Okay, now go ahead and using how this has been introduced, maybe have a conversation with your class teacher. Discuss what background research you might want to use, and go ahead and write up your background research for all 3 research questions as shown. And this should be completed in the Google document that has been set up for your background research.